much people can give to charity or how much charity can spend. Under this amendment, Congress could do what the Citizens United decision rightfully said it could not. For instance, it could not make it a criminal offense for the Sierra Club to run an ad urging the public to defeat a congressman who favors logging in the national forest. It could not stop the National Rifle Association, or it could stop the National Rifle Association from publishing a book seeking a public support for a challenger to a senator who favors a handgun ban, or for the ACLU to post on its website a plea for voters to support a presidential candidate because of his stance on free speech. That should be frightening prospects to all of us. Under this amendment, Congress and the states could limit campaign contributions and expenditures without limit and without complying with existing constitutional provisions. Congress could pass a law limiting expenditures by Democrats but not by Republicans, by opponents of Obamacare but not by supporters. And what does the amendment mean when it says that Congress can limit funds spent in opposition to candidates? If an elected official says he or she plans to run again long before any election, Congress under this amendment could criminalize any criticism of that official as spending in opposition to a candidate. A senator on the Senate floor appearing on Cspan free of charge could with immunity defame a private citizen. The member could say that the citizen was buying elections. If the citizen spent any money to rebut the charge, he could end up being charged. We would be back then to the days when criticism of elected officials was a criminal offense. And you remember the history of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And yet its supporters say that this amendment is necessary for democracy. It's outrageous to say that limiting speech is necessary for democracy. The only existing right that the amendment says it will not harm is freedom of the press. So Congress and the states could limit the speech of anyone except those corporations that control the media. That would produce an Orwellian world in which every speaker is equal, but some speakers are more equal than others. Freedom of press has never been understood to give the media special constitutional rights denied to others. After years of denying it, supporters of political spending limits now admit that enacting their agenda of restricting speech may require an amendment to our fundamental Charter of Liberty. But in light of recent Supreme Court decisions, an amendment soon may not be needed at all. You know, there were 4 justices right now would allow core political speech to be restricted. Were a 5th justice with this view to be appointed, there would be no need to amend the Constitution to cut back on freedom. Justice Breyer's dissent for these 4 justices in the McCutcheon decision does not view freedom of speech as an end in itself. Of course, our founding fathers did view that as an end in itself. Justice Breyer thinks free political speech is about, quote, the public's interest in preserving a democratic order in which collective speech matters, end of quote. To be sure, individual rights often advance socially desired goals, but our constitutional rights do not depend on whether unelected judges believe they advance democracy as they conceive it. Our constitutional rights are individual. They are not collective. Never in 225 years has any Supreme Court opinion described our rights as collective. So, as the Declaration of Independence states, our rights, they come from God and not from the government or from the public. Consider the history of the last 100 years. Freedom has flourished where rights belong to individuals that governments were bound to respect, where rights were collective and existing only at the whim of a government that determines when they serve socially desirable purposes. The results have been literally horrific. So, we should not move even 1 inch in the direction of liberal justices and this amendment, and where this amendment would take us. The stakes could not be higher for all Americans who value their rights and freedoms. Speech concerning who the people's elected representatives should be speech setting the agenda for public discourse, speech designed to open and change the minds of our fellow citizens, speech criticizing politicians, and speech challenging government policies are all in this nation vital rights. This amendment puts all of them in jeopardy upon the penalty of prosecution. It would make America no longer America, and so I intend to do what I can to stop it and urge others to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grassi. I was there, the chair and ranking member of the subcommittee. They'll be handling this. Very brief remarks from Senator Durbin, Senator Cruz, Senator Reid.
For convening this hearing. I know you have and you remind me all the time about all the work that's done out of this committee. Having served in state legislature, in a judiciary committee, I understand much of the work is funneled through this committee, either on a state level or federal level. Senator Grassley, thank you for also your statement. I'm very impressed with the attendance here today. It's really heartwarming to see everyone caring so much about this issue. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm here because the flood of dark money into our nation's political system posed the greatest threat to our democracy that I've witnessed during my tenure in public service. The decision of the Supreme Court have left the American people with a status quo in which one side's billionaires are pitted against the other side's billionaires. So we sit here today with a simple choice. We can keep the status quo and argue all day and all night, weekends, forever about whose billionaires are right, whose billionaires are wrong. Or we can work together to change the system, to get this shady money out of our democracy and restore the basic principles of one American, one vote. Mr. President, just a little bit of history from my perspective. I ran for the Senate in 1974. And I had to be educated as to what the federal laws were. Because in Nevada, we had an entirely different system. Cash was available to politicians. The federal system, that's not the case. And that was not the case. One of Paul Laxalt's very close advisors, a man by the name of Wayne Pearson, who was supporting me, said, understand, under the federal rules, be very careful. You can't take any cash from anybody. The rules are very strict. Whoever gives you money, there's a limit how much they can give. You give their address, their occupation, and be very careful. Any money you take, there's a new system. Well, Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, I've been asking Nevadans to vote for me for decades. And I've seen firsthand how this dark money is perverting our political system. Way back then, 40 years ago, it was pretty easy to do, follow the rules. But I've seen it change. In 1998, I had a very close election with John Ensign. We each spent about $10 million. And we were allowed to do that because the Supreme Court again had left an opening that said you could divert money into the state party. And that money could be corporate money, it could be any kind of money, and that could be used for denigrating the other person or building the person who had the money up. It was a bad situation. I felt so unclean, for lack of a better word. A person could give lots of money. One person gave $250,000 for the state party. Of course, he wanted me to know that he had done it. Now, Mr. President, I hope that did not corrupt me, but it was corrupting And after 1998, two good senators got together and worked very hard to change that. We had the McCain-Feingold law that came into effect that took corporate money out of politics. So when I ran in 2004, it was like I'd taken a bath and I felt so clean. Because it was an election that everyone who was involved in a federal election had to list where they got the money. There was a limit how much you could ask and get from someone else. You listed their occupation and so on. That was wonderful. And then comes 2010. Back into the sewer. That was the race that Citizens United in January had ruled that no holds barred. Any money could come from any source, with rare exception. And that race was, as far as I was concerned, not a lot of fun. 1998. I talked to you about that. 2010 made 1998 seem like a picnic in the park. Money coming from every place. And Mr. President, not a suggestion where the money came from. Citizens for Good Government, good guys, sponsored this one. Now, from 1998 to 2010, I have no idea. I have an idea, but in that race in Nevada, probably $120 million was spent in that race. Can you imagine that? No one knew where the money came from. And the people in Nevada were subjected to false and misleading ads, not knowing anything about these shadow groups. That was 2010. 2012, it even got worse. And here we are, Mr. President. The Citizens United case and the other decisions the Supreme Court has made has only made it worse. During the 2012 presidential campaign, outside groups spent more than $1 billion. That's a conservative estimate. That's about as much money as was spent in the previous 12 elections. But this spike in the amount of shadowy money being pumped into elections isn't surprising. Recent decisions rendered by the United States Supreme Court, I've mentioned it, Citizens United, McCutcheon, have eviscerated our campaign finance laws and opened the floodgates for special interests. The cynics may scoff at the idea of us working together on an issue as critical as good government. But it wasn't all that long ago the issue of campaign finance reform enjoyed support from both Democrats and Republicans. Campaign finance reform has been proposed a number of times before, even by my friend, the Republican leader, Senator McConnell. Senator McConnell's own constitutional amendment, his own, he sponsored it, empowered Congress to enact laws regulating the amount of independent expenditures by any person which, quote, from his legislation, can be made to expressly advocate the election or defeat of a clearly identified candidate for federal office, close quote. In advocating for this reform, Senator McConnell said, and I quote, "We Republicans have put together a responsible and constitutional campaign reform agenda. It would restrict the power of special interest PACs, stop the flow of all soft money, keep wealthy individuals from buying public office," close quote. There's a lot more that he said. But that gives you the general idea that at one time, Senator McConnell agreed without question with me and most of the people behind me. Senator McConnell had the right idea then, and I'm hopeful that we can rekindle a way to bring forth these noble principles again. I find it hard to fathom why my Republican colleagues would want to defend the status quo. Is there any member of this committee who really believed the status quo was good? Although he opposed billionaires using their own money to run for office, Senator McConnell now supports billionaires' ability to fund today's campaigns and independent expenditures. In fact, he even declares today, quote, in our society, spending is speech, close quote. How could everyday working American families afford to make their voices heard if money equals free speech? American families can't compete with billionaires if free speech is based on how much money you have. My Republican colleagues attempt to cloak their defense of the status quo in terms of noble principles. They defend the money pumped into our system by the Koch brothers as free speech. Mr. President, I defy anyone to determine what the Koch brothers are spending money on today politically. They have all these phantom organizations. They've got one now they got a new one on veterans. They've got one on senior citizens, another name. They must have 15 different phony organizations that they use to pump money into the system, to hide who they really are. The two wealthiest men in America, interested in their bottom line. Our involvement in government should not be dependent on our bank account balances. The American people reject the notion that money gives the Koch brothers, corporations, or special interest groups a greater voice in government than a mechanic, a lawyer, a doctor, a healthcare worker. Because they believe, as I do, that elections in our country should be decided by voters. Those Americans who have a constitutional and fundamental right to elect their representatives. The Constitution that everybody loves to talk about doesn't give corporations a vote, and it doesn't give dollar bills a right to vote. The undue influence that my friend decried 3 decades ago has not magically transformed into free speech. David Copperfield in Las Vegas, the great illusionist, couldn't come up with that one. It's still bad for America. It's bad for the body politic. We must undo the damage done by the Supreme Court's recent campaign finance decision, and we need to do it now. I support this constitutional amendment. I admire and I congratulate Senators Tom Udall and Senators Michael Bennet for their authoring this amendment, which grants Congress the authority to regulate and limit the raising and spending of money for federal political campaigns. Senators Udall and Bennett's amendment will rein in the massive spending of super PACs, these secret organizations, which has grown so much since that January 2010 decision of Citizens United. The constitutional amendment also gives the states the authority to institute campaign spending limits at state level. Simply put, the constitutional amendment is what the nation needs to bring sanity back to political campaigns and restore Americans' confidence in their elected leaders. The American people want change. They want their voice in government to be protected. Free speech shouldn't cost the American people a penny, a dime, certainly not $1. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'm happy if you have questions that you want to ask me to wait, and I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I would ask your leave, and I will leave. I've got other places to go.
Thank you. I know both you and Senator McConnell have a great deal of things and following the tradition of the committee, let you both speak and leave. Then we'll have enough time for questions on the floor. So I thank you very much, Senator Reid.
And Mr. President, I want to make sure that my leaving doesn't take away at all from my friendship with Mitch McConnell, and we've heard each other talk and criticize each other for years. So he won't be upset that I'm leaving.
No problem.
Well, as I noted, and I've